إله إلا الله واشهد أن محمد رسول الله.
Classify the study of revelation and reasoning and articulate their boundaries. Reason had a critical role to play in the authentication of truth. That's one area. Okay. Is it true that this hadith came from the Prophet? That was not an article of faith. You don't believe a hadith by faith. Okay. You believe it comes from the Prophet because you have been reasonably convinced. And the scholar had at least four criteria. Number one, is there a chain of narrators? They need to be convinced that when you say the Prophet said, we know exactly who got it from whom and how did we get it today. Number two, they wanted to be convinced that this was a credible chain. That the people in the chain were people that were trustworthy. Not just in their character, but in their competence. So if a hadith was narrated by somebody and it was something to do with business, and they knew the person narrating the hadith had experience in business, they would consider that hadith stronger than a hadith that seems to contradict it, but it was narrated by somebody who had no background in business, because they take it that this person would be a more reliable transmitter than somebody who was not in that field. So they would look at the competence, they would look at the character. They would also look at the contents of the hadith, what they call the matan. Now, what exactly is the hadith saying? Is this the kind of thing we would expect from the Prophet? When we know all the other teachings of the Prophet, if this hadith seems to be teaching injustice, then we cannot attribute this to the same Prophet. We would need stronger evidence. But just the fact that it contradicts stronger evidence, they would drop it aside. Then they would look at the number of chains. You say the Prophet said, only you. The Prophet was around and was a Prophet for 23 years or so. Only you know he prayed like that? Only you knew he said that? Is there anybody else who can corroborate that? The more the chains of independent narrators, the stronger the hadith became. If it was only one chain, particularly during the first 3 centuries, or the first 3 generations, I should say, the Sahaba, the Tabi'een, and those who came before them, that is the companions of the Prophet, the successors, and those who followed after them. If there seems to be just one individual in the whole line, or no more than one, at any point in the line, they would call that kind of a hadith, hadith garib. If they had up to 2 people, 2 corroborating witnesses, they would call it aziz. If they had 3 or more, they would call it mashhur. If they had so many chains that there was no doubt it was authentic and it was reasonably impossible for people to connive or collaborate and fabricate, where they were absolutely certain, they would call such hadith mutawatir. So you had this whole field where people wanted sufficient, convincing, reasonable evidence that they were dealing with revelation. In our terminology, these scholars didn't want to have faith in a doctor's prescription if they were not sure the prescription came from the doctor. Reasoning was not challenging the doctor. Reasoning was to confirm, is this really from the doctor? If there was no doubt a prescription came from Allah, if there was no doubt a prescription came from the Prophet ﷺ, if there was no doubt a prescription came from the doctor, you don't challenge the doctor. No problem, we'll follow. But if there was any doubt, then it didn't become binding. And we will look at how they handled evidence where there was doubt. So reasoning played an important role in the authentication of truth and its credibility. Reason played an important role in the meaning and the implication of revelation, because the language of revelation was human language. It followed human grammar. It used metaphor. It used allegory. It used hyperbole. So do you take this literally or not? This statement, is it to be taken as when it says you should do something? When you are taking a business loan, the Quran says you should put it in writing, faktubuhu. Is that you should do it because it's compulsory, or you should do it because it is encouraged? Which one? There's a big difference. One, if it's compulsory, there's a sin for not doing it. If it's encouraged, there's no sin for not doing it. But the Quran goes into it. You know, whether the amount is large or small, get 2 witnesses, 2 men, or one man and two women. Going into detail. Do we have to? Or is it just a recommendation? Scholars would like to understand the meaning and implication by looking at other verses, looking at how it was understood in the hadith. Was it practiced at the time of the Prophet ﷺ? How did the Sahaba understand this? Another area was to find the wisdom and the higher intents of the law. You know, what's the benefit? What's the objective? What purpose is it trying to fulfill? Alcohol is prohibited. Why? What's the problem with alcohol? Intoxication. Are you sure? If that's a problem, then should we as Muslims have a problem with cocaine and heroin when the Quran is silent about that? So what's the wisdom behind the law? So that we know where it applies, so we know how to handle new situations, and where it doesn't apply. So those who studied that field were scholars of Maqasid Sharia. So anybody interested in knowing why does Islam say this, why, this is the books you need to look for. If you're interested in knowing how scholars handle the meaning and implication of language, of revelation, it's in Tafsir and Sharh al-Hadith. If you want, and this was important, learning the hikmah and illah, because they needed illah or reason for something for the purpose of qiyas. Okay, reasoning by analogy. And we will come to this when we look at why scholars had a problem. They had no problem with organ transplant, but they had the problem with transplanting testicles or ovaries because they contain genetic material, and they are not comfortable with that. They didn't have a big problem with test tube babies and artificial insemination and all these type of things, but they insisted it must be between legally married couples. But if the Quran and Sunnah is silent on this, how do they get to that kind of judgment? With what degree of certainty? And this is where scholars look at what are they really certain about regarding the wisdom and the intents. What are they less certain about? What is pure speculation? Reason played an important role in the application of all of this in changing contexts. And those who handle the subject of, all right, so at the end of all of this, what are you saying? Are you saying it's haram or fard, or what are you saying? What's the fatwa going to be? Those who studied the construction of fatwas, the construction of verdicts, the field and the methodology of ijtihad were scholars who were involved in usulul fiqh and the qawaid, the maxims. These maxims summarized what Islam stood for. And we will come to them. So here, reasoning played a very critical role to establish a methodology of the interaction between reason and revelation. And lastly, reason played a role in the defense of truth by coming up with superior reasoning. You know, when you are going to defend the idea of God exists, there's only one God. When God says, worship me alone, no other. Does God have an ego problem? Is that what it is? Or is there a good reason why a doctor will tell you, I am a doctor? Don't listen to anybody else when he knows there's no other doctor. Would that be an ego problem on the side of the doctor? Or is that actually compassion that the doctor solves your confusion by letting him know your qualifications and letting him know his attributes? So, in the area of defense of truth, superior reasoning, scholars develop the field of ilm al-kalam or ilm al-tawheed and mantiq, the whole field of rhetoric and logic.
إله إلا الله واشهد أن محمد رسول